lead with Family Caregivers of BC, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our webinar tonight on loss and grief. And I am going to change our view here about Family Caregivers of BC. If you are new to our webinars, about Family Caregivers of BC, we are a nonprofit 100% dedicated to supporting family caregivers, and the first of its kind in Canada. We have been in existence for 27 years. We receive most of our funding from the British Columbia Ministry of Health, and we've become a provincial organization, so we cover all of BC since 2010. And 60% of our board members must have caregiving experience, and 100% of our staff do as well. We do a number of things, one of them which is the webinar format that you've signed into tonight, but we have a website with all kinds of resources on caregiving. We have a newsletter. We also have a caregiver support line, and we do one-on-one coaching for complex situations that people are handling a whole bunch of things at the same time. So we would urge you to go to our website and have a look around, call our support line. We're here during the week, Monday through Friday. And we also are coordinating engagement of family caregivers in health sector improvements. So there's opportunities if any of you BC folks are interested in helping us there. There's a way to indicate that on our website. This worked before, Wendy, but somehow it doesn't seem to be working right now. Just a minute here. See that? Sorry, folks. I'm just going to try and, oh, there we go. Make that. So up in the top, you'll see Wendy, and Wendy is our coach for tonight. Wendy contracts with Family Caregivers of BC. She is a gerontologist who lives in Comox and has her own business, Keystone Elder Care Solutions. Wendy has been pivotal in helping us come forward with this new format where we have panel members, so it's very, very exciting. And so Wendy is going to be sort of asking questions and leading the webinar. We also have with us tonight, so now I'm going to profile Tom. Tom Attig, Dr. Tom Attig, and Tom is here with me in Victoria. Tom has a PhD in philosophy and has years of experience, around 25 at the university level, and then as an independent applied philosopher specializing in the area of death and bereavement. He has served as the president of the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling and vice chair of the board of directors of an international work group on death, dying, and bereavement. And Tom has written several books, which I've listed here, his most recent being Catching Your Breath in Grief and Grace Will Lead You Home. And he's actually brought a copy here, so you can show it right in the camera there, Tom. We'll go over how you can get these books, but we're absolutely thrilled to have Tom with us. Our next guest is Christy Linder. Oh my goodness, Christy, and I still have your name spelled, well, one of them's right. It's Christy with a Y. I am so sorry.
That's
anyway,
quite all right.
Christy is an end-of-life practitioner and has over 23 years of experience in hospice and palliative care, currently working with the Comox Valley Hospice Society, and she's also an alumni member of the Meta Institute's End-of-Life Care Practitioner Program. So Christy is committed to mindfulness-based, compassion-focused, relationship-centered care. She's counseled and supported palliative individuals, family caregivers, and bereaved families and their friends, and also has dealt with her own losses, which she says have been her most compassionate teachers. So what a panel. This is going to be really exciting. So Wendy is just now going to step us through just a really quick overview because we really want to be able to interact as much as possible. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Janet. And I had a chance to review Tom and Christy's materials ahead of time, and Yeah, I just think we're so fortunate to have them both on the panel. I just wanted to share one quick story before I go through the presentation quickly, because I think, you know, Christy speaks to this, and I'm sure Tom will as well. But, you know, when part of my work is working with clients typically from, you know, when they're fairly healthy or when they're going through some losses through typically until they die. And I typically work with clients who don't have family that live in the area. And, you know, I just remember my very first client, you know, I helped support her through case management and through advocacy from when she lived independently in her home, through her transition to long-term care, and eventually, you know, was with her when she died. She had one sole daughter, and that daughter lived in Los Angeles. And when her mom was dying, she was in the middle of, you know, quite a complex time with work and with husband and 2 adult children, and she wasn't able to. She wasn't able to be present for her mom's death, and she asked if you know, our company, if I would be with her mom as much as possible, and we used other resources. But something that really struck me around caregiving and loss was, you know, there was about maybe 3 days that I was with this client, and I spent, you know, a number of hours, I'd probably say 6 or 7 hours a day over the course of those 3 days, which I know maybe in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but every time I would bring my phone in and I would call up her daughter, and I'd put the phone up to her mom's ear, and she would talk to her mom, and she would be part of her grieving process and saying goodbye to her mom and telling her what she loved and reminiscing. And it was one thing, I think for me, one of those more powerful parts of that was to be a witness to that and to be part of that process. But then on the flip side, to see it from the caregiving perspective and just the loss of the person, you know, due to death, but also the loss of the person that, you know, her mom from independent to long-term care and then ultimately death. And, you know, Christy, you spoke to this about the learnings we receive from others, and I would say that was the very first person that I was with, you know, from at death. And it probably had the most impact on me in terms of my work, in terms of, you know, being able to witness and learn from that. So I know each of you are going to speak to that process, but it really was quite a beautiful and important moment, you know, in my life just as a practitioner. So that story alone sort of talks to some of the losses of caregiving, and we talk about, you know, we hear from family caregivers, especially, you know, spouses at times, is this loss of self. There's a loss of the relationship they have with that person. Often, you know, with dementia or Parkinson's or diseases that really change the person and their behavior and cognition. There's a real loss of sense around the person that you used to know. And then, of course, the loss due to death. And the relationship changes over time, and what used to be is no longer. And so I know that both Christy and Tom are going to speak to what are the best ways of dealing with loss. Oh, I have control, don't I? Good. I like having control. So some of the losses that, you know, result in grief, I think, again, our experts are going to speak to this, that it's normal to grieve loss. It's a normal process of life, and that it's really what heals us. And I know Tom's going to speak around that component as well. And that there's lots of different types of grief, and whether it's really important to sort of define that. Some of us like to know, you know, where we're at in the grieving process, or lay a definition to it, or have some meaning to it. Others perhaps are more comfortable just knowing the emotions around it or working within those pieces. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that grief is really different for everyone, and that there's so many factors that contributed to it, in terms of the nature of the relationship you have with that person, what past experiences you've had with loss, how comfortable you are often with death, or how comfortable you are with maybe age and some of the changes that come with aging or with particular chronic diseases, and also your personality in terms of how you're able to express yourself and how you're able to work through that process. I think, you know, what's important, and again, our experts are going to lend their experience and their knowledge around this and their research is, you know, how we grieve matters, And often, similar to sometimes when we're in the, we can't see the forest within the trees. Is that the right? So I always mix up my analogies. Sometimes when we're in it, it's hard, to even recognize that we're there. And so often, one of the most important steps is recognizing that we are grieving. Being able to kind of identify how we're feeling. And, I think about, excuse me, some of my own personal experiences with grief, and at times there's so much going on that it can be hard to take a step back and actually take stock of some of those symptoms. And I'd love, that's one of my questions, for Christy and Tom is when you are in it, what are some strategies to be able to take a step back and recognize and see the symptoms and understand how you're feeling? That was something that came up for me in the presentation. And then once you've been able to step back, or once time has elapsed and there's been understanding and figuring out how it's affecting you. And I think Tom was going to speak to this part around how we use grief as a healing process, and also knowing that grief changes as we heal from it and as we learn from it and as we grow from it. I thought this chart was very interesting. I like the pictures are always helpful. Those really nice, clear words would certainly, we put this up here just so that people can get a sense of how they might be identifying with some of their feelings and the intensity of it, and some of the wordings that, or choice of wordings that can go with it. I know, Christy, one of the things we talked about initially was this idea of, self-compassion, and I'm really interested to hear more about your experiences around that, and also about some of the ways when you're working with individuals around how we teach ourselves to be more compassionate for ourselves. And we've spoken a bit about grief as a healing process. I think sometimes for those individuals that have a chance to be able to write down how they're feeling or be able to vocalize it through auditory is also a really nice way to, I think, sometimes be able to name those feelings. There's a term that that I like to use. It's called effortless discomfort, and there's a certain degree of discomfort with grief, and one of the often in even my line of work, and Christy and yours and Tom and yours, we come across people who are dying every day. We come across grief every day, and even as a health practitioner, never mind the person caring, there certainly can be some level of discomfort, and working with it as effortlessly as possible is something that I try to strive for. Just knowing that it's going to be it's going to be uncomfortable. The piece around giving yourself permission. I think sometimes individuals, with grief, we feel that with it we can't always have joy, and I think it's around giving ourselves permission to do things that bring us joy, to see that grief is just as much about at times loss as it is about living and redefining ourselves. I'd love to hear more about some coping strategies or ways to manage some of what people would call the negative aspects of grief. How to find support that's appropriate for you, whether it's in a group setting or one-to-one, or through other mechanisms. Having non-negotiables in terms of a sanctuary, a place where you can be just you or still. And I think the last piece around surrendering to that which you can't change. That's a beautiful way to sum it up. I think, Christy, you're going to talk a bit about some of this in your slides around the RAIN mechanism, and how we experience grief. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to just leave that slide and have you be able to address those pieces. Am I right, Janet? We're at the point now where this is Christy's slide. Is that right?
That's right. So, Christy, okay. I'm going to highlight you now.
Okay. Hi there, and certainly welcome really appreciate you being here and the opportunity to be able to speak to you. I tend to be a storyteller, and so really what I want to do is to kind of talk about grief through just through some experiences themselves. And because oftentimes that which is most personal is also most universal. And while our circumstances may not be the same at all, some of the thoughts, the feelings, and sensations that we experience that are all part of normal living experiences are familiar to each one of us. So really kind of want to speak from that place. Grief is a whole mind-body experience. It does involve both our thoughts about it, how we take in the experience, the feelings that we have, as well as bodily sensations. And oftentimes it's the bodily sensations and the feelings that start to feed our thoughts, and vice versa. Our thoughts start to feed our bodily sensations. So some of it is just kind of being aware of our whole body, the whole mind-body experience that we have. As Wendy had said earlier, certainly it's unique to each individual, and that we have some similar characteristics. When Wendy was mentioning RAIN, which is actually a term used by Tara Brock, it's about recognize what it is that you're experiencing. Allow it to be there without judgment. Investigate it, not from an analytical place, but really just a little bit of kind of curiosity about, what is there. Sometimes there's something that's underlying what we initially see. And then just kind of allowing a natural awareness or opening, because sometimes some things can kind of come up through that. This really is just another way to kind of speak to some of what Wendy had been saying a little bit earlier. Sometimes to have an acronym or a small saying or whatnot can remind us just to do that. So RAIN is a good one to go, oh yes, right, recognize what I'm feeling right now, or what's going on right now, what I'm thinking, what's going on in my body. Just allow it to be there, not judging it in any way. Is there anything else that's going on that might be feeding some of this? And then just kind of pausing and allowing to see what does come up. Just a second, I'm going to switch to the next slide here. So as I said, what I wanted to do is to tell you just kind of a few stories and a few storied experiences that I've had. So in this slide, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to my mother, June, and she had vascular dementia. She had been at home for a while. We were managing quite well for a while at home, and then there was a point in which we needed to be having her in more care, and then from that, after several years, she had a significant health event and passed away. So one of the things that happened with her, and not unusual when we're caregiving, is that I had gone to visit her one day, not particularly wanting to visit so much, but feeling kind of obligated. I hadn't been there for a number of days and wanted to, see how she was doing. But also there was some resistance that was there. And it was a beautiful day. We went out for a little bit of time in the garden, and I, was just really appreciating the spring day, and my mother and I were kind of having a conversation, but we had ended up getting into a looping conversation. And the looping conversation had to do with asking whether or not this was her home. And I would, yes, this is where you live, and those kinds of responses to her. And I was really kind of aware of the irritation and just an unsettledness that I was having in that particular day, not, and while at the same time appreciating that I wanted to be able to be present with her and have good conversation, and I couldn't actually get there. So I was really noticing this kind of tug inside of me of where I would like to be versus where we were, and all of that. By the end of the visit, it hadn't been the best of visits, but I went home and continued to just kind of focus on that for a while, and really realized that some of what had been going on, of course, was the underlying grief of the person who she was, the idea of who I was. I had some judgment in terms of myself as not being as attentive and caring as I possibly could be with her, and just didn't feel comfortable with it, and so decided that I wanted to actually go back and see her again. A couple days later, a little bit, probably a little bit sooner than the length of time between we normally saw each other. But this time when I went in, and I wasn't expecting to have the same kind of conversation, but I was going because I was in a different place. And I had the ability to be able to stay curious in the conversations that her and I had. And in my ability to be able to stay curious this time, different from the last time, was that we were able to kind of engage in a different kind of conversation. And as it turns out, we went back into the same looping about home. Only in this particular case, rather than just kind of responding to her and being irritated about it, I just became curious. And through that process, we were able to talk about not home in terms of a place, but home in terms of a feeling. And how does one know what home feels like? And that's when she was able to talk a little bit about safety, feeling safe and secure and loved and all of those types of things. And that's how we were able to kind of bridge that. I was really pleased I'd had the opportunity for that do-over in this particular instance, because it was only 8 days later that I saw her once again, and it was the beginning of the end for her in that she had a heart attack in my presence. And so really wanted to just acknowledge that, some days are like that we just have these situations where we're not able to be our best, and that there is that kind of underlying grieving that we're oftentimes experiencing and judging in terms of ourselves and our relationship and not always being our best. And we might not recognize it as grieving or loss at that point in time, but oftentimes it's an underlying theme of some of what's going on. So in terms of the kind of going to the next story that I want to talk about, and it really is about finding a place of rest in the middle of things. And this is one of the precepts, sorry about that. This is one of the precepts that Frank Ostaseski from the Meta Institute talks about. And it really is about that we oftentimes don't the idea that, well, when this is over or by the weekend or at the end of the day, all of these future times that we're trying to kind of take care of ourselves or take a moment of rest or that kind of a break, that really it's about finding a place right in the middle of things. And doing that can be something as simple as just kind of stopping, taking a breath, and just kind of come and being present with ourselves. We're breathing all of the time. It's just the awareness of that, to kind of take a breath in and then just to kind of allow it to relax a little bit. This was certainly something that with my mother when she was actively dying, that I was sitting with her. She was in a fair amount of pain. And again, I was feeling overwhelmed, didn't quite know what I should do. I'm been involved in hospice work for 23 years, but it's different when it's your own personal situation, your own family. And I could hear in my mind going, well, I can't do this. We should bring in somebody from hospice, somebody who can kind of help with what all this was. And I kind of stopped and smiled and went, yeah, but I could do this right now too. And so while she was having this pain and this painful experience, I really just started to actually use that phrase, finding a place of rest in the middle of things. So, excuse me. So as she was, taking a breath in, and as she was letting her breath go, that's when I would say, yeah, just follow your breath all the way down to the bottom of your breath. And at the bottom of your breath, you'll find that place of rest. And I would just continue, yes, even with this breath, just follow it down to the bottom of your breath and find a place of rest at the bottom of that breath. Because between the exhale, the finish of the exhale, and the beginning of the next inhale is a moment of rest or peace. And if we can focus in on that place just for a moment, it's oftentimes while we're exhaling as well that's the part where our body is actually relaxing. So if we can actually relax with that letting go breath, find that microsecond at the bottom. And so I just continue to talk her through that. She settled, but just as important, I settled through that as well. It changed the environment of the room, and it actually was able to help her both through her pain, but also through the many, many days for myself, the long, long hours as I sat with her, that I would just continue to say it to myself and allowing myself to relax during those particular moments. Another time to be taking a look at finding a place of rest was an experience I had about 6 months later. My son was diagnosed with testicular cancer, and so all of a sudden I was thrown into another caregiving situation. With my son and his young family and my daughter-in-law, who was 7 months pregnant at that point in time. So really kind of feeling the experience of loss previously, just 4 or 5 months earlier with my mom, and then stepping into this situation with my son and his family. And so finding a place of rest in the middle of things, and that point in time were, again, really just little pieces that were helpful. There was one particular day in which it had been quite chaotic, and my son, his kids, and his wife had gone over to friends. My son was going to be starting chemotherapy the next day, and they'd gone over to friends, and we'd had a very, very hectic morning, and there were lots of underlying emotions that were going on that weren't necessarily being spoken about, that each one of us was experiencing. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was standing at the sink with a mountain of dishes that I was staring at. The dishwasher had broken down. Isn't that so typical of what happens, when we're having things going on in our lives, and then we have these other small but important irritants that come along as well. So I had this mountain of dishes I was doing. I was irritable and cranky and tired, and my back was hurting, and I actually was feeling some irritation towards my son and his wife and whatnot as well. Not for anything in particular, but some certain things that had been going on. And And I realized I could have carried on like that, but I just had a moment of thought of, just a sec, what is it that I need right now? Right? My tendency in the past really would have been to just kind of push through it. But having done some work with some self-compassion, I stopped and just kind of went, okay, what's actually going on right now? What is it that I need right now? What I realized was I hadn't had lunch, and that my back was hurting. And so rather than pushing through the dishes, I just stopped. I decided that I would have something to eat. And the tears actually began to flow at that point because I was actually taking care of myself for just a moment. And it was then that I was able to recognize that I had a lot of fear about what was coming in the coming days as my son started chemotherapy. It was snowing outside, and I was going to have to be driving him in an area that I was unfamiliar, and that there were all of these worries and concerns that I had been projecting out towards my family members rather than really acknowledging what was going on. But by stopping for a few moments and taking care of myself, by looking outside and seeing, normally I enjoy the snow falling and take pleasure in it. And yet I was so caught up that I couldn't do that. By taking that little bit of a break, I was able to kind of reset things. Within 15 minutes, I'd had something to eat. I felt a little bit better. I'd had a bit of a cry. And I went back to doing the dishes, now not with some irritation, but with the idea that by being able to do this thing for them, that they would have more time to spend with their two young girls prior to their going to bed and prior to us leaving the next day for my son to be having some of his cancer treatment. So really, the importance of having a little bit of self-compassion for yourself is so important. I'm going to just give you a couple of techniques to try right now, and then perhaps what we'll do is just stop right here, and then I'll pass some of this on to Tom and perhaps share some more stories a little bit later. But one of the things is that in terms of self-soothing, one of the things that comes from the work of Christian Neff and Christopher Germer is that we often self-soothe without even realizing it. And usually that's when we're touching ourselves. We might be kind of stroking the back of our neck or kind of rubbing our arm a little bit, or, even when we're kind of rubbing our hands together. That, in actual fact, is our unconscious self just doing some self-soothing. And when we do that, we kind of put our hands to our chest or our heart, any of those kinds of things, it actually elicits the neurohormone oxytocin. And oxytocin helps us to feel better, right? It allows us to kind of maintain some big picture thinking, to staying kind of in a creative process, but also just a little bit of soothing. And so it's not going to take one stress level from, from 100% down to 0, but it is going to help bring it down a little bit and help to steer things into the direction of the way that we want to go. So certainly even just kind of as we hear things or even if we're standing in the grocery store or in some of these situations, just the ability to just kind of put our hands on our heart or to rub our arm or those kinds of things will in actual fact be part of that self-compassion and part of helping you to feel just a little bit better. You'll sometimes find yourself doing it unconsciously. I'm just bringing it to your conscious level that then in actual fact is something that you are doing to care for yourself. And one other one that I'd like to just give you before I stop is one that is also connected with the breath. And similar to finding a place of rest in the middle of things, this one also comes from mindful self-compassion and the work of Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer, is it's really a breathing one. And what it is, as you breathe in compassion for yourself. You start with yourself first. So as you breathe in compassion for yourself. And as you breathe out, you send compassion to the person that you care for. Oftentimes as caregivers, we care about others and we give so much to others, we forget to include ourselves in that loop of compassion and care. And so this is just one way that you can do that for yourself, breathing in compassion for yourself, sending compassion out to the other person. You can shorten that by just kind of going one breath for me and one breath for you. Right? And it's just a reminder, and it just takes a second, but it also allows us to hear that we're both giving ourselves compassion. Our body takes that in as receiving compassion. So certainly, again, something that doesn't require anything other than just doing it in the moment. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to, I guess, to Tom, and maybe come back and speak to some of these other things in a little while.
Thank you very much, Christy. That was those stories were quite lovely, and you can see that Janet and myself, we've been trying to capture some of those wonderful pearls of wisdom. Janet, I think I just jumped in, but all that to say, Tom is now going to have a chance to speak to the grief response, and as you can see in the bottom in the handout, there's a PDF that you can download called "A Dozen Good Things About Grieving," which is an essay that Tom wrote. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for Christy. Thank you for your work, Wendy, and thanks for Janet for inviting me here. It's good to be with all of you out there in computer land. I was just using the breathing technique and almost put myself to sleep. I hope not many of you have done the same. It's after a meal. I want to quickly go through a dozen good things about grieving. I think there is a tendency of people to think of grief as only this really hard stuff that comes our way, that's painful, that washes over us, and you wish it could be over, but as life goes on and things don't change as quickly as they might or in ways that you would like, you feel just bad. And I agree that that's true for what I would call grief reaction, which we've been talking about a fair amount. But I want to assure you that grieving is, at its core, when you take in the whole of the experience, a hopeful process. Many people feel very desperate and hopeless as they sense that grief is coming over them. And in the midst of crises in all dimensions of your life, it can sure seem that way. But I want to assure you that hope is a movement of will that has been called active receptivity, and it contrasts with wishing that is more passive, waiting for good to come, often when it's either very unlikely or even impossible. And in hope, we envision, open to, and reach for possibilities of living well, meaningfully, and purposefully. And Helen Keller perhaps said it best when she once said, although our world is full of sorrow, it is full also of the overcoming of it. And grieving is largely about overcoming what comes over us. Grieving is not just about unwelcome and difficult things that happen in our lives, hard feelings that come over us, physical challenges, exhaustion, challenges in your relationships with other people, difficult questions that come to mind about the purpose of living, why are we alive anyway, when is this suffering going to end, why me, why my family, and so on. It's not just about bereavement, and it's not about things that happen to us. that I call grief reaction, things that come over us. It's not surprising that people think of it that way, since the common view that I take exception to is that grieving is something that unfolds in Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. That's not a good way to think of it, nor is it you're coming down with a malady or an illness or a mental disorder that requires someone else to treat you, and so on. Rather, grieving is about what we choose to do with what happens to us, and I call that grieving response. As we grieve, we actively re-engage in living, again, in all dimensions of our being. Grieving is effortful and pervaded with choice. It requires not only time, but effort. And I think of the effort that's required as a process of relearning the world, relearning how to be and act in a world that's been changed by very difficult happenings in your life as someone falls ill or dies. There's no one right way to respond to bereavement, brokenness, and sorrow any more than there's one right way to live. Each of us grieves in our own way and in our own time, just as we learn how to live in our own way and in our own time. Viktor Frankl, writing of living with suffering, against the background of his experience in Auschwitz, once said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance, to choose one's own way." And a good part of what Christie's been telling about is some of those little things you can choose to do in the midst of what's going on. I think of grieving response as asking us to do what we are made to do and what we've been doing since we were born, learning how to live. If I had you all in a room, I'd ask every one of you in the room who would say of yourselves that you have finished learning how to live to raise your hand. And I've never had anyone do that up to now. Well, if grieving is a process of relearning how to live after someone falls terribly ill, or your mother dies, or your son dies, or someone is killed in an accident, or whatever, you'll never stop missing them, and you will never stop loving them. So the idea of closure is not something you need to be looking for, or I suggest that you resist anyone's expecting you to come to closure in your grieving. There will always be events that will remind you that this person has lived and is with you no more presently, but there are ways of dealing with those things, and I'm going to talk about them in a few minutes. We human beings are amazingly resilient. Yes, there's a lot of brokenness in our lives. Our family life patterns fall apart. Our life stories and their unfolding are disrupted. Relationships with others and ties with things larger than ourselves can be challenged and even broken. So there's lots of brokenness out there, but there's a lot within us that is not broken, including our physical health and physical stamina, including our capacities to solve problems, take control of things, get things done, our capacities for love and caring and making ourselves at home, our capacities for hope, for courage, for rising above, for drawing upon faith, for searching for answers, are not broken. They're still there. They can carry us through, sometimes longer than others. And unfortunately, there is such a thing as chronic sorrow that can be an accompaniment for caregivers who for weeks, months, even years find themselves caring for people as trajectories of illness and recovering from illness, from injury and so on, can take a very long time. There's a wonderful book that isn't mentioned anywhere that I wanted to mention along the way. It's written by a woman named Susan Roos, R-O-O-S, and it's called Chronic Sorrow. And if you are in a situation where sorrow is ongoing and things don't seem to be changing all that much in your caregiving experience, I recommend that book to you. Through grieving, we emerge from only apparent chaos. One of the things that can be really disconcerting about grieving after someone has died is, on the one hand, the feeling that everything in your life has fallen apart, and then your resentment that all around you, the world's going on as if nothing has happened. But thank God that world is there, and lifelines that are capable of supporting you, local services, good friends, gurus, pastors, guides of one sort in your life can come through for you or not. And if they don't come through for you, find some others or find a support group.
Yeah.
We can learn from our emotions about things we need in order to heal. Emotions are not just these sensations that come over us that are kind of pesky and you want to kind of distract your attention from them. Lots of people have written that emotions are crying for expression. I take exception to that. I think emotions, as with physical pains, are crying for you to pay attention to them. Physical pains tell you where and how something is troubling in the state of your body. Your emotions tell you where and how something is troubling in your psyche, in your mind, in your soul and spirit. Fear tells you that you perceive a threat somewhere. Helplessness tells you that you need to find control in some way. Deep sadness and loneliness suggest that you have a need for connecting or being cared for. Hopelessness cries out for attention and is calling your attention to a need to find something to be hopeful about, to envision some possibilities that you would like to reach for, and so on. And if you're taking care of someone over a long period of time, you're not necessarily hoping for a complete recovery or survival after death or meeting them after death or whatever. You're hoping for them to be as comfortable as possible and to die as peacefully as they possibly can. You're hoping to be connected well with them. You're hoping to be able to love them. You're hoping to somehow catch glimpses of they're still loving you and the like. We can reach past the pain of separation to reconnect with some of the best in life. It seems to me one of Christie's stories, and I've heard many other stories, about taking care of someone who was falling into a kind of dementia was about how even in those circumstances, there can be moments when you connect again with those aspects of this person that you've been longing to see or hear from for such a long time. There's a lot of research going on these days about the power of using music with those who are going into dementia. If you play the old songs that they loved, they might surprise you and start singing them, and you can sing with them, and they might remember some of their experiences around that song in the early days of their lives, and it's wonderful to do that kind of connecting. After a person has died, the world is full of all kinds of things that remind you that you are separated from the person who has died. But they remind you that you are separated from that person because they also remind you of aspects of your life with that person, of aspects of their character, and so on. And if you can reach past the pain of the experienced separation to connect with some of the best in life that is connected with that place, that thing, that relationship, that other person, that event, and so on, you can reconnect with some of the best in life. This is very healing. At its heart, grieving is a labor of love. You wouldn't hurt so much. This brokenness and sorrow wouldn't come over you if you hadn't loved your son, your wife, your husband, your mother, your father, your grandmother, your dear friend. And grieving is a process, I think, that at its heart has a challenge of moving from loving someone in their presence to loving them in separation. I always ask people in workshops, how many of you in this room brought all of your living friends and relatives with you to the workshop today? They're in the room. Afterwards, you could bring them up to me and I could shake their hands and say a few words to them. No one ever says that they brought everybody with them. Then I ask them, and how many of you think they stopped loving you when you left to come to the workshop? And how many of you stopped loving them when you left them behind to come to the workshop? Nobody thinks that. The truth is we know an awful lot about loving people in separation. It's what we do most of our days. Most of the time during the day, we're apart from one another. But we don't stop loving one another. We give one another attention. We draw inspiration from one another. We remember one another. We tell stories about one another. We're grateful for one another, and so on. When we're apart, you can still do all of that when a person has died, or even when a person has slipped into dementia. You still have what they've given you. You still have your memories of them, and you can still do all of those things I was just talking about. Remembering is the key to loving in separation. And remembering is magical. Just as perception allows you here to perceive something over there and connect with it, remembering allows you now to recall and connect again with what was then. And you're not engaging with images in your head, you're engaging with mom again, or with your best friend, and so on. It's magical and it's wonderful. And one of the things no one can take away from you is the stories that you and only you know, or that you and the other members of your family together know about the person who's died. And one of the things you can do at the end of life as people are suffering terribly on the way to death in some ways, when they're properly medicated or their pain has been relieved or whatever, they can engage in life review, and you can engage in life review with them. They can tell you some things about their hopes for you after they go. You can make commitments and promises if you choose to, and then make sure that you live up to those. Grieving enables us to recognize and to embrace enduring legacies of lives now ended or ending. The most important gifts that other people give us are not material gifts. The most important gifts that they give us are gifts of love and lessons in living. And after they die, those gifts can keep on giving. And grieving, through remembering, enables us to remember what we have been given. And a good part of effective grieving and loving in separation is feeling gratitude for what we've been given and using well the legacies that we've been left. As grieving brings us together in love through separation, as it returns us to wholeness, as we reshape our lives and redirect our life histories, as it enables us to be ready for reconnecting with those who survive with us, it enables us to reach again and find response from the divine, however we might conceive of it. We become whole again in many different ways. Grieving is a healing process. That's what I've got in mind. And I think some grieving can help you heal even while you're still in the presence of a person who is dying, as you connect and connect and connect again in loving ways.
Certainly a lot of themes that have come out in the discussion and in the presentations, and I think the one thing that that Janet and I, well, on behalf of Family Caregivers British Columbia, that we like to encourage is that if there are any participants that have a question or a particular scenario, I think that would be this would be the time for you to either raise your hand or if you're willing to share, to put it in the chat box. We've prepared a few questions for Christy and Tom. However, we also recognize that it's also really, really important to be able to share some personal experiences. So I see a couple people are going to start typing, and we might just wait a moment for that. But it looks like there's a couple actually. But one question I'll start off with, and this is much more of and this was, my observation, when I was watching my mom go through a grieving process for my dad, through not just his brain tumors and his strokes and when he was on life support and having to take him off life support. But, what was interesting for me was the way my mom, put that grief in a box very quickly. And for her, that was her coping mechanism. And I think, so this is, the question I had was, sometimes when we're part of this family and someone dies and people react differently to grief, sometimes I feel that there can be a judgment based on how one person grieves versus another. So my mom put that grief in a box, and she very rarely visits that box with her kids, or she might do that privately. Whereas as children, our grieving process is very different. So can you talk a bit about some of the family dynamics around that with family caregivers, and just how we can be really some mindful practice around seeing grief as a process for everyone and those different pieces?
Jump in, Tom.
Okay. Yeah, I'll jump in here. Everybody has a different life to relearn. Everyone's at a different point in learning how to live. People who have been intensely and almost constantly involved in caregiving, physically present with someone who is taking a while to die and so on, can have a lot of the feelings of and the reactions of grief come over them in that process, especially if there's, say, a loss through dementia, and you're spending a lot of your time saying your goodbyes over and over again in different ways as a person is slipping through your fingers. And I think it's entirely imaginable that some people get to the end of a life without a whole lot more of intense anguish, sadness, and so on to feel, though they may, and most likely will, have an additional impact of, this is it, this is the last time I can see him, the last time I can touch him, the last time I can kiss him, and so on. And there will be that pain, and there will be the missing that they're carrying with them. But it seems to me that they can be in a quite different place from the relative who has been living in the next province or the next state and hasn't been eyewitness to much of that, and has been having a hard time taking in phone conversations the reality that this person's been living with day to day. And I think the kids need to be patient with and respectful and honor mom where she is. And mom needs to understand that the kids are going to be a pain in the behind for a while if they think that she's sort of moving too fast or too slow. And I think the general counsel is, please be respectful of one another's own experiences. Try to imagine what it may have been like for the person who witnessed next to nothing, as opposed to the person who witnessed and did almost everything. And just appreciate there will be inevitable differences, and people are on different parts of their journeys. I mean, people who are 80-year-old caregivers and they spent the last 2 years of their lives taking care of a dying spouse are in quite a different place from the children who've been grinding away at the offices and phoning in now and again just to check in.
Thank you, Tom, for that. Christy, I'm going to get to you, but Janet, did you want to read some things from the chat box, or would you like me to?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you, everyone, for contributing your comments. And Tom, I think I certainly agree with your point around reminding us to respect everyone's place in grief, and that it is different for everybody. It's just something common that we come across where within families, sometimes it's hard to separate that, separate the emotional piece around it versus just the pragmatic, where people are at within their grief. So, Shemai, and if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I'm so sorry. I just thought it was pretty interesting how you said you're pretty amazed at how many different levels of grief there are, and that it often deepens the love that we share. Jane, you're mentioning, I'm noticing how long grieving takes. Perhaps it's because of time with age is speeding up, but regardless, it seems to be a longer process. I think that would be an interesting one to explore. And then, Shema, you also mentioned that it was very difficult for you to grieve during your full-time caregiving. It wasn't until your husband was in the hospital that the grief could express itself more fully. And one of the comments made back was that perhaps that was your way of being able to cope until, to keep it going and to a point where there was that opportunity for you to make space, as Christy speaks to be able to allow that grief to come out. Christy, are there any of those that you would like to speak to?
Well, yeah, I think that, just a sec, I just lost my train of thought there, that certainly grief,
Uh-oh, we've lost you, Christy.
I think we've lost the sound. Yeah.
Oh, shoot. Christy, we've lost your sound.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
Oh, darn it. Oh, shoot.
I wonder if she has muted us by error.
Can you type in how to unmute just in case? No, she's looking at her phone. Okay, I think Christy's going to try and figure out her phone situation, which is unfortunate. Right, okay. So, Tom, was there anything that you wanted to pick up on? There's a big comment here about, this was my mom for 5 weeks while she was in palliative care dying from cancer, and while dealing with that, I was also trying to deal with my mother's biggest fear was what was going to happen to my sister who had Down syndrome and been living with her since she was born. When her mother did die, it took my sister so long to understand what had happened to her and where she had gone. She didn't really grieve either. I never saw her cry, even though she saw me cry many times and knew it was because of her mother's death. Yeah, oh my goodness, I could see how that would be incredibly difficult in terms of the differences in how people grieve. Tom, is there anything that you'd like to speak to?
Well, I was not quite on that point, I don't think. I was just remembering my own brother's experience a few years ago. He was married for over 50 years to his wife, and she had wound up with mesothelioma, and it took her almost 2 years of treatments on and off, remission on and off, and eventually dying at home in the living room on a hospital bed with hospice people coming in and so on, but my brother being there constantly. And finally she died in that living room with her 2 daughters and my brother there. And within 5 or 6 months, my brother reconnected with a woman he had known from some time before in his life, and began dating, and then eventually married again. And his daughters really had a difficult time with that, and he was living against an experience where his wife, who died, had told him, you're not going to do very well on your own after I go. You need a wife. And if you know somebody, by all means, feel free to make that connection. So he married a second time with their blessing, but her blessing. But on the other hand, the daughters became a bit problematic and weren't in that same place at all, and really had to see over a period of months and a year or so how well he was doing in this new relationship. But at one point, they expressed some pretty serious concern, and he said, look, I'm almost 80 years old. I just lived the 2 most miserable years of my life, and I don't want any more of that. I don't want to waste my limited time. I hope you can understand. If not, kind of stay out of the way until you can.
Smart words.
Not an uncommon story.
No.
No. Christy, are you back? Oh, no, she has no sound. Oh, gosh darn it. Okay, that's too bad. Has she tried dialing back in? Oh, she's saying yes. Oh, isn't that just a shame? I wonder what happened. Oh, dear. Okay. Well, feel free, Christy, feel free to type in. Pardon?
She is still a...
Click on it.
Yeah. Christy, feel free to try and, you can type in into the chat box if you have any responses. Please do that. Was there anyone else that had some questions for us or examples? Christy's saying, okay, she's going to try. One of the questions that arrives in our inbox or on the phone a fair amount, or even in dealing with the caregivers that we do our caregiver coaching with, is and Christy spoke to this a little bit, but with her mom, but we see it in spousal relationships where that individual is mourning the loss of the relationship they once had, and they've been married for someone for so many years, and they've been capable in many, many different ways, and whether it's through chronic illness or mobility or cognition, that relationship changes. And I was just curious whether or not Christy or Tom had any advice or any strategies to help with that grieving process, or ideas around that process.
Christy, are you able to respond?
I think she's typing.
She's going to type first.
Ah, okay. Meantime, I think in some senses you have lost the relationship in the sense that now, given course of illness and developments and changes in personality and behaviors of the person who is being cared for, you can really sense that you are living with a different person. And I think it's probably a good idea to forgive them for becoming different and to do the best you can to remember what you want to still honor about the person that they have been in your life. And hope to sometimes connect with parts of that person. And if a person you are caring for is turning into an angry, abusive, even threatening or destructive person, then you need help to find support for them. You don't want to risk injury, including psychological injury, if things really get to be abusive.
One thing from a practitioner's perspective is, one of the pieces that we encourage caregivers to think about, or a phrase that I often use is to often remember that in most cases it's not the person, it's the disease that's causing the change in the behavior, and often as a result the relationship. So especially if it's with dementia, that's well beyond their control. They have no control over that disease. Similar with pain. There are ways to manage pain, but when pain overcomes us, so that's often a common phrase that we try to encourage people to think about as well.
Sounds good.
Were there any other comments from the chat box here? I know Shamai is talking about dealing with the anticipation of death on a daily basis. Right, especially if it's towards the end of life, as being much more imminent. That's an interesting thought. Tom, do you have anything with regards to that, to this anticipation of?
I've been witness to last days where people feel compelled almost to sit vigil round the clock. I've seen people in situations where beds have been set up next to hospital beds or in hospices or at home, so people can be sort of constantly there, and if they doze off, if there's any ruckus, they're there and can immediately attend to what's happening. I think of anticipatory grief as grief that we experience, and pain and sorrow and anguish and grief reaction that we experience while we're anticipating that someone is dying. and sometimes we need to be cared for as we are grieving in anticipation. I think another aspect of anticipatory grief is anticipating, loving in separation. And there are ways in which people can have very meaningful conversations about their legacies and their hopes for people who are going to survive them, and their intentions to honor those who are dying after they die, or their intentions to take care of someone who has been dependent on the person who has died, or the like. So anticipatory grieving as anticipating, continuing loving in separation, telling people who are dying, I'll never forget, and then you share the story. I'll always appreciate how you taught me this important lesson. I'll always remember the time when we went and had this experience together, and how it really changed my way of looking at things, and the like. So I think anticipatory grief is not necessarily anything that we need to dread.
Well, it's certainly different. I mean, if you asked a caregiver, well, if you asked anybody really, would you rather have 2 months with someone before they died, knowing they were going to die, versus seeing them or goodbye and then never seeing them again? Obviously, that's going to depend on the person, but I would think that most of us, if we were in a healthy, loving relationship with that person, we would choose that. We would choose that path of having that time to express that piece. One of the things I just want to bring up, Tom, that you had connected with, which I think is so important, and Shemai, I do see your question there about if men and women grieve differently, but I'll just finish this point, is that I have a daughter who lives long distance, and her mom is quite demented, but she can still read and she can still enjoy letters. And her daughter and I had a conversation, and she said, "Well, how can I best show my mom or tell my mom how much she meant to me and means to me?" And Tom, exactly what you said. One of the things I suggested was, it'd be so lovely for your mom to read letters about how much of an influence she had on your life and those specific moments on how you impacted her. And so one of the things that they share is this love of figure skating and skating. And skating was this prime thing that her daughter hung on to when she was facing some severe issues around addiction. And I see my client reading these letters every time I visit her, and I think there are certain ways that we can respond to grief, and anticipatory grief in particular. So thank you for sharing that.
I have another story, not so much on anticipatory grief, but that kind of ambivalence that you might feel as death is approaching. My Uncle Billy, who is as hard-bitten a man and all in his head kind of man as you would ever care to meet, was married to his wife Jo for 63 years. Wow. And the last couple of years of her life, she was bedridden and at home and cared for very well by hospice. They much appreciated the support and so on. But she was a misery on top of a misery on top of a misery. It was not a good time. And I met my Uncle Bill a couple of years after Jo had died, and we were at a breakfast at a family reunion, and he said, Tom, there was one morning, 6 months or so after Jo had died, and I was having my usual morning pity party for myself, and oh God, I wish she could be here, I wish she were here. And then he said, I don't have thoughts like this very often, but I thought, no, not like she was. I wouldn't want her to have lived any longer. And I kind of worry a little bit that maybe it was her sensing that I needed her to stay alive that enabled her to be miserable longer than maybe she needed to. But I'm working on forgiving myself for that.
Interesting.
Thanks, Tom. One of the questions that's come up in the chat box is, and I'm sure this is difficult, this is, I know it's a statement that is not black and white, but just generally, do men and women grieve differently?
I think each of us learns how to live differently, so I'm thinking yes. I think there are tendencies, but it would be almost stereotyping to articulate those tendencies. I've met some very active, get it done kinds of grievers who haven't articulated a feeling in their entire lives, and some of them are men and some of them are women, and I've met people who just sort of gush with feelings and are expressing themselves to the nth degree and articulating subtly and nuanced ways all of their feelings and reactions, and some of them are men and some of them are women.
Yeah, I think it's very, very true. You know, I think about right. Yeah. Janet was just was articulating that. I think about my Uncle Bob, who is this incredibly what I would describe it certainly doesn't have any fear around expressing his emotions. And I remember I was at my at his mother's funeral, reading out part of the obituary, and at the start of it, I was thinking to myself, don't look at Uncle Bob because you're not going to make it through, in one piece, because it just sort of elicits this emotional response. And then there's, my sister who, is just keeps everything inside, and that's, and that's her process too. And so it's focused on my sister because, not that I'm not afraid to show emotion, but I do want to be able to speak clearly through this obituary. So it's very different. Oh, that's interesting. So Christy says that there are masculine styles and feminine styles that are not specific to gender, and that we all have some masculine and feminine traits in each of us. Yeah, that's a good point, Christy. Yeah, I can see how that would apply. Yeah. Were there any other questions from our participants? We've got about 10 minutes left. And Janet, did you have a question or?
We did receive one on the website, and that was if you are supporting someone who is going to be losing a loved one, so a friend, perhaps you're supporting someone who's caregiving, what kind of advice would our guests have for that?
I figure we're not hearing from Christy anymore.
Yeah.
I'll tell a story. I used to have a woman come to classes that I taught whose daughter died from a fall off a swing set in her backyard at age 3. And she, over the weekend after the fall, died in the hospital, and they discovered that she had an illness in her brain, actually, that had been undiscovered. And she just died suddenly and traumatically, and so on. And she talked about how so many in the world around her were seemingly afraid of mentioning her daughter for fear of making her cry. And she said 2 things. One, I'm crying anyway. You can't make me cry. And 2, it's really eerie to live in a world that seems intent on never mentioning my daughter again. And the person I appreciated most, many of my friends just wanted to stay away from me because they didn't know what to do, they didn't know what to say, and they seemed like they wanted to make things better, which is not what they could do. I needed comfort and so on. She said there was a neighbor, and my daughter played with the neighbor girl. So this woman called me up and said, I know that Mary has died, and it's got to be really difficult for you. and you know that Mary played with my little girl. I have some photographs of the two of them playing together. When you're ready and when you'd like to, I'd like to have you come over to the house for a cup of coffee, and I can show you those photos if you'd like to see them. Boy, did she want to see them. And it was good for her. And it turned out that the woman next door and her daughter both really loved her daughter, and were willing to talk about her daughter, and so on. I remember going to a funeral of a mother of one of my daughter's best friends, and the best friend was in high school, as was my daughter. So I'm hugging this girl, who's the daughter of the woman who's died after 2 or 3 years with cancer, and she was doing the stiff upper lip stuff and so on, and I said to her, you know, you might feel like this formal occasion here, we're at a wake, is not a time when you can really let yourself go, but at some point it would be a good idea to let yourself cry. I know you've been crying, and it would also be a good idea, I think, for you to think when you can about the most important things that your mother ever gave to you, and how many of those things you still have. So I think a willingness to talk about the person who's died, encouraging people to remember together with you. I said to her, sometime, if you want, I would be happy to sit down with you. I didn't know your mother very well, and you could tell me about her. And she was keen on doing that.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Tom, for sharing that.
So we've had our panel discussion. I will make the presentation a handout as well, because there's some wonderful references. Thank you to both Tom and Christy for all of these wonderful references. And Christy, I'm saddened that you weren't able to finish your oral presentation, because your stories were so wonderful, but so appreciate you still being a good sport and typing into the chat box. Yay. And yeah, Christy actually did share with us some of the words of loving kindness by Ezra Beta, and these will be in the presentation that I and we'll sign off, everybody, and thank you again for attending, and thank you so much, Tom Attig and Christy Linder, for being our guests tonight. What a pleasure.
Yeah, wonderful.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye, Christy.